The word landed like a slap. Not a whisper, not a murmur passed between two men in a tent flap. A declaration, made in the open air of a military staging area in southern France in the autumn of 1944, in front of 400 soldiers who had stopped what they were doing. Because when a commissioned officer raises his voice in a military camp, you stop what you are doing and you listen whether you want to or not. The officer was white. He was a lieutenant, 24 years old, from a town in Georgia that most people outside Georgia had never heard of, and most people inside Georgia had already forgotten. He had been in the army 14 months. He had been in France 6 weeks. He had the specific confidence of a young man who had been told, in every context that mattered to him, that his opinion carried weight in the courthouse and the church and the dinner table and the draft board, and who had not yet encountered a situation that challenged that assumption in a way he could not dismiss. The soldier he was pointing at was named James. James was 22 years old. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, which in 1944 was not a place that offered a great deal of space to a young black man who wanted to be taken seriously. He had worked since he was 14. He had a mother who told him every morning before school and every evening before bed that he was worth exactly as much as any man alive, a statement she made with a certainty that Birmingham spent considerable institutional energy trying to contradict. He had been drafted in 1943, processed through a segregated induction center, assigned to a segregated unit, trained in a segregated camp in a segregated state, shipped to England on a ship where the black soldiers were quartered separately from the white soldiers, and transported to France to fight for a country that had not yet decided whether he was a full citizen. He was standing in the staging area because his platoon had been ordered there. He was standing quietly, the way men stand when they are trying not to give anyone a reason to notice them, the specific practiced stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is a form of protection. The lieutenant had decided to notice him anyway. What the lieutenant said in the hearing of 400 men was that James had shown cowardice during the previous week's action, that he had failed to advance when ordered, that he was a disgrace to his uniform, that he was exactly what the lieutenant had expected from the beginning. He said this last part slowly, with a specific emphasis, looking at James the way men look at things they have already decided the value of and found wanting before the examination began. The word he used before, coward, was not a military word. It was the other word, the one that the Army's official regulations prohibited in formal settings, the one that was technically a violation of military conduct standards to use in reference to a subordinate, the one that 400 men heard clearly because the lieutenant had not bothered to lower his voice. James did not move. He did not speak. He stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes straight ahead, and he performed the specific kind of discipline that is more demanding than anything a drill sergeant can ask for, the discipline of not responding to something that deserves a response, in a situation where responding would cost you more than the thing you were responding to was worth. The 400 men watching did not move either. And then a jeep pulled up. The man who got out of it was the commanding general of the division. He was 51 years old, a graduate of West Point, a veteran of the First War, a man who had been in the Army for 30 years and who understood military culture with the specific intimacy of someone who had been shaped by it from early adulthood. He had heard the lieutenant's voice from 40 yards away because the lieutenant had not been trying to be quiet. He had heard the word. He had heard what followed it. He walked toward the staging area. The lieutenant saw him coming and came to attention. 400 men came to attention. James came to attention. The general stopped in front of the lieutenant. He looked at him for long enough that several men present later said they had lost track of how much time was passing. Then he said something that nobody in that staging area had expected to hear from a general in the United States Army in 1944, in front of 400 men, in a theater of war where the official policy of the institution he served was that black and white soldiers did not eat at the same tables, or sleep in the same barracks, or train in the same facilities, or serve in the same units. He said it anyway. And what he did afterward, not just in the next 5 minutes, not just in the next hour, but in the weeks and months that followed, in reports filed and actions taken and battles fought, changed the lives of the men in that staging area and changed something in the record of what the United States Army was capable of being, even while it was still, officially, something considerably less. To understand what he did and why it mattered, you have to understand what the black soldiers of the United States Army in World War II were being asked to do, and what they were being asked to accept while they did it. Because the story of what happened in that staging area in southern France in 1944 is not a simple story about one general and one soldier. It is a story about an entire generation of men who fought in a war for values their country had not yet extended to them, and about the rare individuals on the other side of the uniform color line who saw this clearly and acted on what they saw. The United States Army in 1944 was a segregated institution. This was not a recent development or an accidental one. It was a policy, deliberate and defended, that had roots going back to the founding of the military, and that had been codified and reinforced through every period of American military history. Black soldiers had fought in every American war since the Revolution, had fought with documented distinction, had produced Medal of Honor recipients, had led charges and held lines and performed acts of courage that the official record acknowledged when it could not avoid doing so, and minimized or ignored when acknowledgement was inconvenient. What the official record could not do in 1944 was pretend that the treatment of black soldiers was consistent with the values the war was supposedly being fought to defend. The war against Nazi Germany was, in its official articulation, a war against racial ideology, against the belief that certain groups of human beings were inherently inferior, inherently subhuman, inherently unworthy of the protections that civilization was supposed to provide. This was not a subtle point. It was not buried in the fine print of the Atlantic Charter or the Four Freedoms. It was front and center in the propaganda, in the speeches, in the posters, in the newsreels. The Nazis believed in racial hierarchy. America did not. That was officially the difference. The black soldiers being processed through segregated induction centers and trained in segregated camps and shipped to France in segregated quarters had not missed this irony. They had not missed it because it was not possible to miss it. It was present in every aspect of their military experience. It was present in the assignment of black units to support and service roles, truck driving, ammunition handling, labor, rather than combat roles, which reflected the Army's official position that black soldiers were not suited for the psychological demands of combat. It was present in the officer corps of black units, where the senior positions were frequently held by white officers who had been assigned to segregated units as a career management decision, rather than a command assignment they had sought or valued. It was present in the town of almost every training camp in the American South, where German prisoners of war were sometimes served in restaurants that refused to serve the black American soldiers who had captured them. The specific and documented fact of German POWs eating in segregated Southern diners while Black American soldiers were turned away was not a rumor or an exaggeration. It happened. It was written about by the soldiers who witnessed it, in letters home that the Army censors passed because the censors were looking for operational security violations, not for documentation of institutional racism. It was the kind of fact that, when you encounter it, you can either incorporate it into your understanding of what the country was in 1944, or you can set it aside because incorporating it is uncomfortable. The men who lived it did not have the option of setting it aside. James, the soldier standing in the staging area, had lived this reality his entire military career. He had been drafted into a segregated unit. He had trained in a segregated facility. He had shipped to Europe on a segregated vessel. He had arrived in France and been assigned to a support role because the Army's official position was that Black soldiers were not suited for combat, a position that was being quietly undermined by the performance of Black units in Italy and in France as the manpower crisis of late 1944 made the luxury of excluding any available soldiers from combat increasingly difficult to sustain. The allegation the lieutenant had made, that James had shown cowardice during the previous week's action, was the specific kind of allegation that white officers made against Black soldiers with a frequency and a casualness that the official record documents extensively. It was an allegation that was nearly impossible to disprove, because the standard of proof required for a charge of cowardice in a military unit was low, and the word of a white officer against the word of a Black enlisted man in 1944 was not an evenly weighted contest. It was the allegation that had ended careers and court-martialed men and destroyed reputations, sometimes on the basis of nothing more substantial than a white officer's decision that a Black soldier had not moved fast enough or fought hard enough or deferred sufficiently. The general who got out of the jeep had read the reports from the previous week's action. He had read them carefully, the way he read everything, with annotation, with follow-up questions, with the specific attention of a man who understood that the paper version of what happened and the actual version of what happened were not always the same thing. The reports did not support the allegation. What the reports showed was that James's platoon had been ordered to advance across a piece of ground that artillery had not cleared, toward a position that intelligence had characterized as lightly defended, but that turned out to be defended by machine gun emplacements that were not in the intelligence summary. The advance had stalled. Men had taken cover. The platoon had pulled back. These were not the actions of cowards. These were the actions of soldiers who had received inaccurate intelligence and had responded to the real situation rather than the briefed one, which was exactly what military training was supposed to produce. The cowardice, if the word applied to anyone in that action, was in the intelligence failure, in the decision to send men across ground that had not been properly reconnoitered, in the planning that had not accounted for the discrepancy between what was known and what was actually there. None of this was James's fault. The general stood in front of the lieutenant and said, in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be raised because 400 men were standing in absolute silence, that he had read the after-action reports from the previous week, that the action in question had been conducted against a position that was significantly more heavily defended than the intelligence briefing had indicated, that the platoon's response to unexpected contact, taking cover, returning fire, pulling back to a defensible position, was correct by every standard of infantry doctrine, that the men who had been in that action had not failed. The intelligence had failed them. He said that the word the lieutenant had used in reference to Private James was a violation of military regulations and a violation of basic human decency, and that in his command, military regulations and basic human decency were not optional. He said this in front of 400 men. He was not finished. He turned to James. He looked at him directly, which was a thing that required, in 1944, in the United States Army, more deliberate intention than it should have. He said that Private James's conduct in the previous week's action had been consistent with his training and consistent with the situation he had encountered, and was not a matter for criticism. Then he turned back to the lieutenant. What he said next was the thing that men who were present talked about for the rest of their lives, in bars in 1946, and at reunions in 1956, and in interviews with historians in the 1970s, and in letters to their children that their children found in boxes after they were gone. He said it quietly, which made it carry further than shouting. He said that he had been in the Army for 30 years, that he had served with black soldiers in the First War, and had read the records of black soldiers in every American war going back to the Revolution. That the specific allegation the lieutenant had made, that a black soldier was inherently less capable of courage than a white one, was not supported by any evidence the Army possessed, that it was contradicted by extensive evidence the Army possessed, and that any officer who made it in his presence again would find himself explaining his theory to a court-martial board. He said that the men in front of him, all of them, every man in that staging area, were soldiers of the United States Army. That the United States Army was currently engaged in fighting a war against an enemy whose foundational ideology was that certain groups of human beings were inherently inferior to others. That he did not intend to run a command that operated on the same ideological basis as the enemy they were fighting. He paused. He said, "We are either fighting for something or we are not. I intend for us to be fighting for something." The staging area was completely silent. Then the general turned and walked back to his jeep and drove away. The men stood in the silence for a moment that several of them later described as among the most significant of their military service. Not a battle, not a decoration ceremony. A moment in a staging area in France when a general said out loud something that the official institution he served had not yet said, and would not say officially for several more years. The lieutenant was transferred within 48 hours. The transfer was handled through channels, with the paper language of administrative adjustment rather than the specific language of disciplinary action, because the general understood that the Army in 1944 was not capable of processing a white officer's public disciplinary action over his treatment of a black soldier without producing institutional disruption that would cost more than it was worth. He had learned over 30 years in the Army the difference between the statement and the action. The statement, what he said in that staging area, was for the men. The action, what he did in the paperwork that followed, was for the institution, navigated in the language the institution understood. The lieutenant went to a different unit. He did not receive a formal reprimand in his service record, which was the Army's way of handling things it could not officially acknowledge while still handling them. Whether he understood what had happened or carried the specific grievance of a man who believes he was punished for telling the truth is not recorded. The men in the staging area went back to their duties. James went back to his platoon. The general went back to running his division. And the war continued, as it did, absorbing each of these moments into its ongoing machinery and moving forward. What happened next, in the weeks and months following that morning, is where the story becomes something more than a single dramatic confrontation. The general was not finished with what he had started. He had said the public thing in the staging area. The private thing, the work of actually changing what he could change within the constraints of what the institution permitted, was longer and less dramatic, and in many ways more important. He began to look more carefully at the composition of his unit assignments, at the distribution of combat roles versus support roles, at whether the men in the support units had been placed there by an assessment of their capabilities or by an assessment of their race. He began reading the service records of black soldiers in his command the way he read after-action reports, with annotation, with follow-up questions, with the specific skepticism of a man who had been told a story and wanted to check whether the story was accurate. What he found was consistent with what he had suspected and more extensive than he had expected. Men who had been assessed as unsuited for combat roles on the basis of evaluations conducted by officers whose assessments were shaped by assumptions rather than evidence. Men who had been denied advancement that their records otherwise supported. Men who were performing support functions with a competence and reliability that was documented in the same records that rated them unsuitable for the more demanding duties. He began to move people, carefully within the constraints of what the Army's structure permitted in 1944, which was not the same as what the Army would permit in 1948 after Truman's Executive Order 99-81 desegregated the military, but which was enough, worked deliberately and persistently, to make a difference that could be measured in assignments and in outcomes. He encountered resistance, not from the men he was moving, who performed exactly as he had expected them to perform. From the institutional structures, from other officers who believed the Army's official assessments were correct, or who understood that they were not correct, but believed that challenging them was not worth the professional cost. From a command culture that had been built around assumptions so fundamental that questioning them felt, to the people who held them, like questioning the laws of physics. He did not stop. He continued reading the records. He continued making the assignments that the records supported. He continued showing up in his Jeep to staging areas and training grounds and after-action briefings, and being, consistently and without drama, the kind of commander who saw the men under him as men. This is not a story with a clean ending. The United States Army in 1944 was what it was, and what it was could not be changed by a single general making assignments in a single division in a single theater. The segregation continued. The systematic disadvantaging of black soldiers continued. The gap between the values the war was being fought to defend and the values that structured the institution fighting it continued, documented and undeniable and officially unremarked. What changed within the limits of what could change was what this general could make change. The men in his command performed in ways that the existing assessments had said they were incapable of performing. The record they made, documented in after-action reports and decoration citations, and the testimony of officers who served with them, was a record that the institution could not erase, and that provided in the post-war years evidence that the institutional assumptions had been wrong. James survived the war. He came home to Birmingham in 1945, to a city that had not changed in the ways that his service had perhaps suggested it might. He came home to the same segregated streets, the same segregated institutions, the same systematic denial of the things that his country's foundational documents said were inalienable. He came home with a service record that said he had performed his duty under fire in France, And that said nothing about the morning in the staging area when a lieutenant had called him a coward in front of 400 men. He came home as a veteran who could not vote in many states, could not use the GI Bill's benefits in the same ways as white veterans, could not walk through the front door of establishments where German prisoners of war had been served while he had not. He came home carrying what a generation of black veterans came home carrying, the specific weight of having given something to a country that had not yet decided to give the same things back. The general who had gotten out of the jeep that morning also came home. He came home with a service record that documented his command in France and his conduct of operations and his various administrative decisions, most of which were recorded in the institutional language that described military administration without capturing its human content. What he had done in that staging area was not in the official record. It was in the memories of 400 men who had been there, and in the service assignments of the men he had moved, and in the performance records that those men had accumulated, and in the specific way that some things done in private leave traces in the world that outlast the people who did them. He retired from the army in the early 1950. He did not write a memoir about what he had done. He did not give speeches about it. He did not, in the language of the era, make it a cause. He had been a general in the United States Army, an institution with its own culture and its own constraints and its own way of measuring what mattered, and he had operated within that institution as the kind of man who understood the difference between saying the right thing and doing it. He had done both. The story of the black soldiers of World War II is, in the end, a story about debt. A debt that their country has been in the process of acknowledging, imperfectly and inconsistently, since before the war ended, and that it has not yet fully paid. The 761 Tank Battalion, the first black tank unit to see combat in the European theater, entered combat in France in November 1944 and fought for 183 consecutive days through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. Their commanding general, George Patton, told them when they reported to him, "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It was not the language of equality. It was the language of a man who evaluated soldiers by what they could do, and the 761 did it. They were nicknamed the Black Panthers, and they fought through the Bulge and across Germany, and they were not awarded the Presidential Unit Citation they had earned until 1978, 33 years after the war ended. The Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots of the 332 Fighter Group, flew more than 15,000 individual sorties over Europe, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, and were documented in mission reports as never having lost a bomber they were escorting to enemy fire. Whether this specific claim has been challenged by subsequent research is a matter of ongoing historical debate, but what is not debated is the quality of their performance. They flew. They fought. They were consistently denied the recognition that the same performance by white pilots would have received automatically. The 92 Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, fought in Italy through 1944 and 1945 against a mountain defense that was among the most formidable in the European theater. The assessments of their performance were complicated by the specific fact that the assessors were often working from assumptions that shaped what they saw, and that the same actions that were described as aggressive initiative in white units were described as reckless disorganization in black ones. The record is complicated. The men were real. In the staging area in southern France in 1944, when a general got out of a jeep and said what he said in front of 400 men, he did not change the army. He could not change the army. He was one man in one command in one theater, and the army was a massive institutional structure with policies and procedures and a culture that had been decades in the making and would take decades more to change. What he did was smaller than changing the army and larger than a single moment. He demonstrated something. He showed the 400 men in that staging area, the white men and the black men, he officers and the enlisted, the men who had agreed with the lieutenant and the men who had not, that an alternative was possible. That the words in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Atlantic Charter could be treated as genuine commitments rather than aspirational rhetoric. That a man in a position of authority could look at a black soldier and see a soldier. He showed James that someone in the institution had seen what had happened and had not looked away. This is a smaller thing than full equality. It is a smaller thing than justice. It does not repair the damage that had been done to James by the Army's treatment of him throughout his service, or the damage done to every black soldier who had been evaluated by assumptions rather than evidence, or the damage done to the country by the gap between what it said it was and what it actually was. But it was something. In 1944, in a staging area in France, it was something real. The men who were there remembered it because it was the day they discovered that the institution contained, somewhere inside its official policy and its segregated tables and its segregated barracks, and it segregated everything. At least one man who would get out of his Jeep and say what needed to be said in front of everyone who needed to hear it. They remembered it because it was rare. Because rare things, when they happen, imprint themselves on the people who witness them with a force that common things do not. Because what the general did that morning was not just professional conduct or military discipline or command authority being exercised correctly. It was something more basic and more important than any of those things. It was one man seeing another man clearly and saying so. In a war being fought against an enemy that had built its entire ideology on the premise that some men could not be seen clearly, that some men were not, in the fundamental sense, men at all, this was not a minor thing. It was, in its small and specific and human way, exactly what the war was supposed to be about. The staging area emptied out that morning. The soldiers went back to their duties. The Jeep drove away. The lieutenant was transferred. James returned to his platoon. And somewhere in a file cabinet in a military administrative office, the after-action reports from the previous week's actions sat in their folders, documenting what had actually happened and contradicting the word that had been used in front of 400 men in the open air of a French autumn morning. The reports were accurate. The word was wrong. And for one morning, in one staging area, in the middle of a war that was being fought about exactly this question, a general had stood up and said so. That is what he did. That is why it mattered. That is why the men who were there never forgot it. There is a particular kind of courage that the military decorates, and a particular kind that it does not. The kind it decorates is documented. It has witnesses, or at least a chain of witnesses. The sergeant who watched the private throw himself on the grenade, the lieutenant who saw the machine gun emplacement taken, the captain who submitted the after-action report that became the basis for the citation. The decorated courage is the kind that can be written down in military language, that fits into the existing framework of what valor is recognized to look like, that can be processed through an award system built on the assumption that the people submitting nominations and the people reviewing them share roughly the same understanding of what deserves to be honored. The kind it does not decorate is harder to name. It is the courage of James, standing in a staging area with his hands at his sides and his eyes straight ahead, not responding to a word that deserved a response, performing a discipline more demanding than any drill sergeant had required. It is the courage of the men in the 761 Tank Battalion, who reported to Patton's Third Army in November 1944, knowing that if they performed well, the recognition would be slow, and if they performed badly, the record would be swift. It is the courage of the Tuskegee pilots who flew missions over Germany, understanding that their performance was being watched not just as a record of individual military conduct, but as evidence in an ongoing argument about whether black men could do what white men could do, an argument that should not have existed, and that they were required to answer every time they climbed into a cockpit. This courage is not smaller than the decorated kind. It is, in some respects, larger, because it operates without the structure that decorated courage relies on, without the unit cohesion that comes from shared identity, without the cultural reinforcement that tells a soldier his sacrifice will be acknowledged, without the implicit promise that the institution he serves sees him fully and values what he provides. It operates on something more basic than institutional support. It operates on the decision, made individually and daily, to continue doing the thing that the situation requires even when the situation does not offer in return what it should. The black soldiers of World War II made this decision in numbers so large and with a consistency so documented that the evidence of it saturates the historical record of the war. They made it in the segregated training camps of the American South. They made it on ships crossing the Atlantic. They made it in supply depots and truck convoys and ammunition dumps and airfields. They made it in combat when they were finally allowed to enter it in numbers, performing with a quality that the existing assessments had declared impossible and that the after-action reports documented anyway. They made it in staging areas in France, standing with their hands at their sides. The generation of black Americans who served in World War II came home to a country that was beginning, slowly, and with extraordinary resistance from the portions of itself that had the most to lose from the change, to reckon with the distance between its stated values and its actual practices. The Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home, had articulated this reckoning before the war ended, in the black press and in the speeches of black community leaders, and in the letters that black soldiers wrote from overseas that their families saved, and that historians have spent decades reading. The war created pressure that the country could not fully absorb without changing. The men who had fought in it, who had fought for a set of values that their country had not yet extended to them, came home with a clarity about the contradiction that could not be unseen. Some of them became the civil rights movement. Some of them raised children who became the civil rights movement. Some of them continued the specific, daily, undramatic work of building lives of dignity within a system that was actively structured to prevent it, which was itself a form of resistance that the history books have not always found the language to honor. The general who got out of the Jeep was one data point in a much larger story. He was not the hero of that story. The heroes of that story are the men who served in conditions of systematic disadvantage and performed with consistent excellence, who maintained their dignity in staging areas and their effectiveness in combat, who came home to a country that owed them a debt it was slow to acknowledge, and who continued, in various ways and with various tools, pressing the claim. But the general mattered. He mattered because of what he represented, the possibility that an insider could see the system from inside and act against it, within the constraints of his position, using the tools his position gave him, in the ways that his position made possible. He could not desegregate the army. He could not change the policy that assigned black soldiers to support roles on the basis of race rather than capability. He could not give James the vote in Birmingham, or the GI Bill benefits that white veterans received without challenge, or the right to walk through the front door of a restaurant that was serving German prisoners of war. He could get out of his Jeep. He could say what needed to be said. He could make the assignments that the records supported. He could be, within his command, the kind of general who saw the men under him as men. This is a smaller thing than what justice required. It is a larger thing than what most men in his position did. The staging area in southern France has been a residential neighborhood for the better part of 80 years. The specific plot of ground where 400 men stood in silence in the autumn of 1944 is, in all probability, occupied by something entirely ordinary, a house, a commercial building, a parking area, something that has no awareness of what occurred on that ground before it was built. The men who stood there are almost all gone now. The last veterans of the European theater are in their late 90s, and the number who retain clear memories of specific incidents shrinks each year. What remains is the record, the letters that were written and saved, the interviews that historians conducted before the witnesses were gone. The service records that document in the dry language of military administration, the assignments that were made and the performance that followed, and the decorations that were awarded years and decades after they were earned. What remains is the story. The lieutenant said a word that should not have been said. The general heard it. The general did not look away. He got out of the Jeep. He walked across the staging area. He said what the moment required. And 400 men stood in silence and understood that something had happened that did not happen often enough. Something true and necessary and real in the middle of a war being fought about whether truth and necessity and realness applied to all human beings or only to some. The answer the war was supposed to produce was, to all. The answer the country was still working on was, to all. The answer the general gave that morning, in the specific and limited and human way that one man in one staging area could give it, was, yes. To all, including James, including every man in that staging area who had been told, in every available language, that the answer was no. The staging area went back to its noise and its business. The war continued. And the debt that black soldiers carried and that their country owed them, continued to be what it was. Real, unpaid, and witnessed, at least for one morning in one staging area in France, by a general who got out of his Jeep and looked at it directly. That is not enough. It was never enough. But it was true. And in a war about whether truth mattered, it was, at minimum, the right answer given in the right direction. The word coward was wrong. The word the lieutenant used before it was wrong. The general said so. 400 men heard it. Some of them never forgot. None of them should have. The autumn of 1944 in France was the moment when the United States Army's official position on black soldiers began, quietly and without announcement, to collide with the reality of what the war required. The manpower crisis that had been building since the summer, the gap between the soldiers the Army had and the soldiers the Army needed, reached a breaking point in the weeks following the Normandy breakout. The advance across France had been faster than anyone had planned for. The supply lines were stretched. The replacement system had not built its pipeline far enough forward. And the German army, which newspapers and radio broadcasts had been describing as nearly finished since August, turned out to be neither finished nor nearly so in October when it was defending the Siegfried Line, and in December when it launched the Bulge offensive, and reminded everyone who had been comfortable that the war was not over. In this context, the Army's policy of assigning black soldiers primarily to support and service roles, a policy that kept a significant percentage of available manpower out of combat positions, became increasingly difficult to sustain. Not on moral grounds, on practical ones. There were not enough white combat soldiers to hold the front lines at the operational tempo the campaign required. Something had to give. What gave at the end of 1944 was the formal resistance to using black soldiers in combat roles. In December 1944, the Army put out a call for black volunteers from service and support units who wanted to retrain as infantry and join combat units. The call was answered with a speed and completeness that surprised the officers who had been assuming that black soldiers were less motivated for combat than white ones. More men volunteered than the program could accommodate. They were retrained. They were deployed. They fought. The performance of these volunteers, documented in after-action reports and in the assessments of the white officers who commanded the integrated platoons they served in, the Army was not willing to integrate at the unit level yet. But the platoons within units were sometimes mixed, was consistent with what the earlier performance of dedicated black units had shown and what the existing assessments had said was impossible. They fought well. They held their positions. They advanced when ordered and held when ordered and performed the full range of infantry functions with a proficiency that the retraining program, which was shorter than standard infantry training, suggested should not have been achievable. The officers who submitted these reports sometimes added editorial comments. Some were neutral, factual documentation of performance without interpretation. Some were surprised in ways that their language made visible, the language of men who had expected one thing and found another, and had not yet fully revised their expectations to match the evidence. A small number were the kind of report that a general who had been making different assignments than the official assessment supported would recognize, reports that said, between the lines of their bureaucratic language, what he had already decided was true. The men were soldiers. They could do the things that soldiers do. The assessment that they could not had been wrong. This is documented. It is not a retrospective revision of history. It is in the reports that were written at the time by officers who were trying to describe what was in front of them in the Army's own language for the Army's own institutional purposes. The documentation was always there. It was available to anyone who wanted to read it. Most people did not want to read it because reading it meant confronting what it showed, and confronting what it showed meant confronting the distance between the Army's official position and the truth. The general who had stood in the staging area in the autumn had been reading this kind of documentation for years. He had been annotating it, following up on it, making assignments that it supported. He understood something that the Army's official position refused to understand, that the existing assessment of black soldiers had not been produced by evidence. It had produced the interpretation of evidence, and the interpretation had been shaped by assumptions that the evidence, read honestly, contradicted. He understood this the way that people who have paid attention to how institutions work understand it, not with anger, necessarily, but with clarity. With the specific clarity of a man who has read enough reports to know the difference between what the reports say and what the reports are actually showing. He was not alone in this understanding. There were other officers, not many but some, who had arrived at similar conclusions through similar processes. They worked within the same constraints. They made the same kinds of careful, institutional, paper-language adjustments that the official structure permitted. They added their data points to the record that was being quietly built against the position that the Army had officially held for longer than any of them had been in it. The Army was changed in 1948 by an executive order. Truman signed it. It said that the armed forces of the United States would operate on the basis of equality of treatment and opportunity regardless of race. It did not immediately end segregation in practice. That took years of implementation and resistance and further pressure. But it ended it in principle, in the official position of the institution, in the policy that officers were required to follow rather than permitted to circumvent. The men who had been fighting in 1944 were either still in the Army in 1948 or they were not. The ones who were still in it lived through the transition. The ones who were not came back to a country that was beginning in 1948 and more substantially in the decade that followed, to reckon with the question of whether the values it had declared it was fighting for in 1940 one applied to the men who had done the fighting. James came back to Birmingham. Birmingham in the decade after the war was not a city that moved quickly toward the answer that the question required. It was a city where the existing order was defended with a ferocity that made clear how much was perceived to be at stake in maintaining it. It was a city that would be photographed in 1963 in ways that went around the world and made the answer to the question unavoidable for people who had been finding ways to avoid it. The men who marched in Birmingham in 1963 included veterans of World War II, men who had stood in staging areas in France and held their hands at their sides, men who had volunteered to retrain as infantry in December 1944, men who had flown over Germany in P-51 and driven Sherman tanks through Belgium and carried ammunition across France in trucks that ran 20 hours a day for months. They had answered one question about what they were capable of. They were still waiting for their country to answer the other. The general was retired by then, living the life of a retired military officer in a country that had changed considerably since the morning he got out of his Jeep in a staging area in France. He had watched the Army desegregate. He had watched the country argue about what desegregation meant and how far it extended, and whether the legal structures that enforced separation in the South were different in kind from the institutional practices that had structured the Army's treatment of black soldiers. He had his own views about this, formed over 30 years of military service, shaped by what he had seen and what he had read, and what he had done with the authority his position had given him. He did not write a memoir. He did not give speeches about this particular part of his career. He was a military man, and military men of his generation and his temperament understood that the work you did was the record, not the account of the work. The account was secondary. The record was what persisted. The record, in his case, included the assignments he had made and the performance that followed. It included the men who had served under his command and who had the service records they had earned rather than the service records that the existing assumptions would have produced if no one had been reading the reports carefully. It included the 400 men who had been in that staging area and who carried, in their memories for the rest of their lives, the morning when a general got out of a jeep and said what needed to be said. It is not a record that appears in the histories of the European campaign, in the way that Patton's advance, or Montgomery's operations, or the Bulge, or the Rhine Crow. Sing appear. It is not the kind of record that gets chapters or maps or strategic analysis. It is the kind of record that lives in individual memories and in letters in boxes and in interviews that historians conducted before the witnesses were gone. But it is a record, and records, however incomplete, are better than silence. The word that was said in that staging area was wrong. The word that the general said in response to it was true. 400 men were present. The war was about exactly this. The staging area in France was not Omaha Beach or Bostonia or the Rhine. It was not one of the places that the histories mark as decisive. It was an ordinary piece of military ground where an ordinary morning was interrupted by something that should not have been ordinary, a lieutenant with a word he should not have used, and a general who heard it and did not look away. The extraordinary thing is not that the general did what he did. The extraordinary thing is that it was extraordinary. That in an institution built on the premise that some men were less capable than others on the basis of their race, an institution fighting a war against an enemy that had formalized this premise into the foundation of its state. A general saying the obvious true thing in front of the men who needed to hear it was remarkable enough that those men remembered it for the rest of their lives. That is the indictment, not of the general, of the context. The general did what should have been routine. The fact that it was not routine, the fact that 400 men stood in silence because they were not accustomed to hearing what they were hearing from the kind of man who was saying it, is the measure of how far the institution had been from what it should have been. James went back to his platoon. The 400 men went back to the war. The staging area went quiet again, in the ordinary noise of a military camp doing its ordinary business. And somewhere in that quiet, the small true thing that had been said hung in the autumn air of France, witnessed and recorded in no document, but in the specific memories of specific men who would carry it home, across an ocean, to a country that was not yet finished with the question. Not finished, but for one morning at least answered. There is one more thing to say about what happened in that staging area, and it is the thing that is easiest to miss, because it is quieter than the confrontation and less dramatic than the general's words. It is about the 400 men who watched. Not all of them were black. The staging area contained white soldiers as well, officers and enlisted men, men from the South and men from the North, men who had grown up in households where the assumptions the lieutenant was expressing were so ambient they had never been identified as assumptions, and men who had grown up in households where those same assumptions had been contested and argued over and partially rejected. Men who had arrived at the war with different understandings of what they were fighting for and what the men beside them were worth. All 400 of them were watching. The ones who agreed with the lieutenant before the general spoke, and some of them agreed, because some of them had been trained from childhood to agree, in the specific way that training which happens before a child can evaluate it tends to persist unless something disrupts it. Those men were watching a general contradict something they had believed was true, or at least something they had believed was permitted. Something they had believed could be said in a military camp in France in 1944 without consequence. The general showed them it had consequences. This is not a small thing. The history of how cultural assumptions change is largely a history of people in positions of authority demonstrating that the assumption is wrong or impermissible or both, in situations where the demonstration can be witnessed by enough people to matter. The lecture that changes one student's mind. The court decision that changes one jurisdiction's practice. The general who gets out of his jeep. These demonstrations do not change everyone who witnesses them. The lieutenant who was transferred did not, in all probability, revise his fundamental assumptions, because a general corrected him in front of 400 men. He probably carried a version of the encounter in which he had been wrongly disciplined for speaking a truth that the general was too politically constrained to acknowledge. People generally produce the interpretation of their experiences that their existing framework can accommodate. But some of the men who were watching were not yet set in their frameworks. They were 22 years old, away from home for the first time, in a situation that was disrupting most of the comfortable assumptions of their previous lives. They had seen things in France that were not in their prior experience. They had fought beside men they had been told to underestimate and found they had been told wrong. They were still forming the opinions that they would carry for the rest of their lives. For some of those men, that morning was one of the data points. A general getting out of a jeep, saying clearly what was true, making consequences for what was false. Some of those men went home and voted differently than their fathers had voted. Some of them raised children who grew up with different assumptions than the ones they had arrived in France with. Some of them did none of these things, went home, and resumed the attitudes the culture had built in them, found ways to set aside the morning in the staging area, continued forward on the path that their background had prepared. This is how cultural change works, not uniformly, not immediately, not through a single dramatic moment that converts everyone present, through the accumulation of demonstrations repeated across enough contexts and witnessed by enough people that the weight of the alternative evidence eventually exceeds the weight of the inherited assumption. The general was one demonstration. There were others in other staging areas and other command posts, and other moments when someone in authority said the obvious true thing instead of the convenient, comfortable thing. Each of them added to the weight. The weight eventually tipped the institution, not because the institution decided, on its own and from internal moral pressure, that it had been wrong, but because the weight of evidence, of demonstrated performance contradicting official assessment, of international visibility creating political pressure, of veterans returning to a country they had fought for and pressing the claim that the country owed them what it owed everyone, became heavier than the institutional inertia that had maintained the old order. James came home to Birmingham. He knew what he had done and what he was worth. He had always known. The question was whether the country would eventually know it too. The answer in 1944 was not yet. The answer in the decades that followed was slowly. The answer in the specific morning of a staging area in France, with a general standing in front of a lieutenant and 400 men watching, was, this general knows it. These 400 men are witnessing it being said. That is not justice. It is not equality. It is not the full answer to the question. But it is a true thing said in the right direction. And true things said in the right direction, repeated often enough by enough people, eventually become the truth that institutions can no longer deny. The staging area emptied. The soldiers went back to the war. James went back to his platoon. And the debt continued, real, documented, unpaid, waiting for the country to become the thing it had said it was fighting to defend. It is still waiting in some respects, but it is less unpaid than it was. And in a staging area in France in 1944, a general got out of a jeep. That was where this particular part of the payment began.